Yeah, g'day YouTubers, Spanner Man here again with another video. It looks like one of the most popular videos out there on YouTube to do with chainsaws is using a Raker gauge tool. A lot of people that get a chainsaw aren't too familiar with it. They're not too familiar with the sharpening process, and there's certainly a lot of people don't even use or even aware of using a Raker tool. A Raker tool sets the height of the tooth, so this is a working adjustment. Highest point of the Raker to the highest point of the tooth is, on a brand new chain, is 0.65 of a millimetres. This constant depth gauge shows that 0.65. So when you place this over the chain, if the Raker protrudes through this little gap, you put the file over the top and you proceed to file it. This metal here is actually harder than the file, so it's quite easy to run the file over there and you won't cause any damage. Unlike this Oregon gauge, you can't do that because it's made out of soft metal, and you can see the file marks that are on there, and you'll destroy this gauge in no time. So this gauge is really only good to check. Now, for those that may be interested, Raker gauge tool was invented by Joseph Burford Cox, and he had two patents on the Raker gauge tool. He had an adjustable one, had a worldwide patent on that in 1952, and I wish they had that today because I'd certainly buy one. And the flat gauge, which is a constant gauge, had 25 thou at one end, which is 0.65 of a millimetre, 30 thou at the other end, which is 0.75. So that flat constant gauge had a worldwide patent on it a year later in 1953. It wasn't until Ray Carlton, that actually worked for Oregon Tool Company, left, and in 1968 made his own progressive depth gauge, which he called Philo plate, and put a worldwide patent on that in 1968. Now, there's a lot of people that can't get progressive depth gauges, so there's quite a few companies that make them. This is the Still progressive depth gauge. They're chain specific, meaning that your 5 different chains, your 1/4 inch, your 3/8 low profile, your 0.325, your 3/8 standard, and your 404, you need one of those for every chain. Same as in the Husqvarna, that's a Husqvarna type 1. It has a soft setting for softwood and a hard setting. The Husqvarna also have another one here, hard and soft setting. This goes over the chain. This is used to file the teeth to keep it at a 30-degree angle. So that's a combination file guide as well as a progressive depth gauge. Why is a progressive depth gauge superior? The reason that it's superior is that when we place this on a chain, it will sit on 4 teeth. So if we place that on top like that, it's sitting on 1, 2, 3, 4. You can get a few false readings. When you file the Raker with a Raker gauge tool and you take a little bit of metal off here, it sets the distance between the highest point of the tooth and the highest point of the Raker at 0.65 of a millimetre. When you use a progressive depth gauge, which Ray Carlton invented, it sits on an individual tooth. As the tooth wears down, the Raker protrudes through that little window a little bit more. So if we zoom in there and you run the file over the top, this metal is harder than the file. It's 62 Rockwell. It's the same as the other gauge, this one here, 62 Rockwell. Now, a lot of people use this gauge. This is probably the most common. And it's okay until the teeth wear down about halfway. Then it really becomes inefficient. This gauge here is totally superior because it sets the correct depth. even if the teeth are smaller or longer, long as you've got the correct depth, your chain will never cut crooked. It doesn't matter if the teeth are longer or shorter. With a progressive depth gauge, it'll take care of that because it's doing each individual tooth, and the depth will be set accordingly. In the perfect world, yes. If everything is equal, the tooth is the same length, the raker is the same height, that's the perfect world. But we don't live in the perfect world because some teeth get damaged during the use of using the chainsaw. This is where the progressive depth gauge is superior. Got a good example here of a tooth that's slightly worn down. This is a little bit shorter. So if we were to place this gauge over the top and zoom in and grab a file and run it over the top, it barely touches the top. If we place the progressive depth gauge over the top, I will guarantee that it will take off more metal. Now that's taken off more metal. That's on the hard setting. If we put it on the soft setting, it'll even take a little bit more. Look at the difference. So it's definitely taken off more. We'll do another tooth on the opposite side because you can really see on the opposite side good. There's one that's maybe a little bit shorter that's been filed. So if we're to take the standard gauge, virtually does nothing. Take the progressive depth gauge on the hard setting. There's a little bit more there. So that's taken a little bit more off. I think you can see that angle there. Put it on the soft setting, it will take even a little bit more again. I think you can hear it. I mean, that's the difference. So the progressive depth gauge sets the height differently based on the height of this tooth. So as you file this tooth down, the height decreases and it'll adjust this accordingly. Now, as I spoke before, this gauge, the constant depth gauge, will only ever maintain a 0.65 millimeter depth between the top of the tooth and the top of the raker. So when we use this gauge and we get to the end of the life of the tooth, which is down here, the height from here to here using a progressive depth gauge won't be 0.65 of a millimeter, it'll be about 1.2 millimeters. That is almost double. Because if you use a progressive depth gauge, your cut-in efficiency from brand new to end of life won't drop off. When a chainsaw tooth goes on the bottom of the bar and gets ready to bite into the timber, it strikes the timber, pushes the tooth, so here the toe of the tooth comes off the bar till the raker strikes the timber, takes its little chip, tilts back up and goes along, and you find out you got this rocking motion. All the teeth have this rocking motion. And this type of gauge is superior, and this is the one that should be used. It's certainly not marketed by any of the chainsaw companies except Husqvarna sell them on the shelf. Go into a steel dealer. That's about the only raker gauge that you'll buy at a steel dealer. The progressive depth gauge from Stihl has to be ordered in. You can't find this on the shelf. I don't know why, don't ask me. You can't even get them in America. Why, I don't know. But for those people that are in America, there is a company that was formed only in 2018 called West Coast Saws, Maple Valley, Washington. So in 2018, the company was formed. They sell a few versions of the progressive depth gauge and they're very popular. So for those people over in America that want to get themselves a progressive depth gauge, do yourself a favour, do a search, Google search, and put in West Coast saws, and they'll come up, and you can get online and you can order whatever you want. Just remember those 5 sizes: 1/4 inch, 3/8 low profile, 0.325, standard 3/8, and 404, because these are chain specific. Only one chain size fits one progressive depth gauge. You can't use that progressive depth gauge on any other chain. That's the only other advantage of using this, because you've got 1/4 inch, 3/8, 0.325, and 3/8 pico or low profile. The only other advantage of using this, you've got the little windows in here, and when you place this onto a tooth, and we'll see if we can zoom in there so you can see this, you'll be able to see that you're filing at the correct angle. So you can see that angle there. It's pretty, look at that, spot on. So you've got 30 degrees on this side here. You've got 30 degrees on that side. You've got 10 degrees also. 10 degrees here, 10 degrees there. 35 here and 35 there. And you've got 0 degrees there. On the side, you'll notice this is for the side plate. You got 85 degrees here, 75 degrees here, 60 degrees here, 90 degrees there, and 80 degrees here. So this is to check the side plate. So you can sit it over the top and you can check the angle on here. And that's what that's used for, to make sure that you're relatively within the right, correct angle. When you do file using a file, and you're doing your, I'll just grab one here, make sure that you are holding your file at 30 degrees. You'll notice that I've got here 30 degrees, 25, 30, and there's 25. So I use this little vise and this little jig so that when I am filing, I can see that the line, and I'm not this way or I'm not that way. So these lines help me line up on the tooth. You can go to the steel dealer and buy a little plastic magnetic little unit that sits on the side of the bar. That works quite well. You do need something. You can judge your 30 degrees, but you'll generally find out that you're liable to make up to 5 degrees even more, that if you don't get it right. So it's good to have some sort of tool or some sort of reference to 30 degrees so you know where you're filing, or you may have 25 degrees. The tool that's still, and I can actually put it up, we'll just put a picture up here. That's what the tool looks like. It's got magnets on it, and you can flip it over. You've got 25 degrees on one side and 30 degrees on the other. So really does work well. The rakers are the most neglected part of chainsaw maintenance. How often do you check them? Well, I check them every single time because I've got that many chains. I can't remember when I checked a specific chain last. So typically, after I've sharpened chains, and I could sharpen half a dozen at a time, then I would just put the correct depth gauge tool or raker gauge tool on the chain and just sort of check half a dozen teeth. Yep, that's okay. Probably you need to do an adjustment with the file probably about every 3rd or 4th time that the chain is sharpened. At least check it. You don't need to check it every time, but as I said, I could do half a dozen chains, so I don't know when it was checked last because all the chains look the same, especially if they're all 3/8. I can't remember, did I do this one last week or the week before? So typically I just use that and do a check. So look, I urge you to do yourself a favour. It's okay to use this when the chain is brand new, but by the time the chain wears down a little bit, you really don't want to be using that. once you buy yourself one of these type of gauges, you will find out that they are superior. You do have the hard setting for hardwood and the soft setting for softwood. So yeah, look, they really do work well. Do yourself a favour and get one of them. And as I said, if you live in America, go to West Coast Saws over there and you'll be able to get one that are just as good as the Stihl ones. Only one thing to remember is that these type of gauges from Stihl, at least, are probably the better ones out there on the market, because they are hardened to 62 Rockwell and a file is roughly about 58. So these are much harder than a file. Also, the ones from Husqvarna, they're pretty good. They're actually quite popular. These are great as well. Not as aggressive as the Stihl. The Stihl are the most aggressive, but nonetheless, this type is very popular, very simple. And again, it is so easy to use. Just a matter of putting it over the top and running the file over. Very easy to use. Highly recommended. Do yourself a favour. Stop using this gauge, especially on a chain that's second hand and it's been filed 3 or 4 times. Upgrade to one of these type of progressive depth gauge, even if it's one from Husqvarna. Doesn't matter whether it's Husqvarna or Stihl or even West Coast Saws, they are superior compared to the constant flat gauge, which will only ever set 0.65 of a millimetre gap between the highest point of the tooth and the highest point of the raker. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.